And we're on. All right. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This has been requested by a couple of my friends for a while now. Now, I was initially a bit hesitant towards making a YouTube channel because of the fact that, I feel like there's enough channels out there, talking bullshit. And so I thought, having another channel of another white guy talking some bullshit perhaps would not be most fruitful for what the world needs right now. But I don't know, I kind of got slightly over that. There's a spider there that scared me. Slightly got over that because of the fact that I love talking, and specifically I love talking about philosophy, and this is what I sort of aimed this channel to be about. And I sort of wanted to correct a little bit of things that I see online, because philosophy has been becoming a very big space nowadays on YouTube, but it's a space that usually people fill with shit. A lot of videos lately have been sort of about how a particular philosophy has warned us about a certain controversial figure, and most of those videos are pretty bad, except the Marx one. The Marx one was pretty good, I would say. I forgot the name of the guy who made it, but it was a good video. But the ones about Nietzsche are very terrible because of the fact that they sort of give reductionist readings of Nietzsche. People who never studied Nietzsche, for example, just will go out there and just give their opinions on things that they don't quite understand. I think the most abhorrent thing I saw was somebody described the death of God as leading to the individual's sense of self being entirely internal. And he said that this was a pathology, something that Nietzsche saw as something bad that would lead to the decay of society, the rise of the individual, which to me seemed very counter to what Nietzsche lays out in the Spoke Zarathustra, and Beyond Good and Evil, and Genealogy of Morals. Nietzsche's philosophy, I wouldn't really argue that it's an individualist philosophy entirely, because after all, the Übermensch is not something that just an individual ought to aspire to be. I caught my cigarette. But rather, the Übermensch is something that society should aim at breeding and creating to be the new setter of values, to be the new head of society. Nevertheless, this video is not about Nietzsche. This video is about Plato. But before we get to it, the cigarettes for these videos, for this video specifically, are Newports, which technically are not allowed. So, but hopefully the feds won't look at this. They don't really give a shit about this stuff. They're too concerned with little kids nowadays. I don't have a lighter, so I'm gonna use a matcher. All right, and we're on. So, as I mentioned before, this video is about Plato. Why did I choose Plato specifically? Well, I think Plato's a good thinker to start a philosophy channel with. But not only on that point, I'm also doing a lot of research on Plato for a paper that I'm currently working on, which is about what this video is about, which is how is it that the sensible world partakes of the formal world. And we're going to deal with all these terms, don't worry. Because all of these, are important and have relevant definitions. But I think that in order to really be able to speak about Plato in any meaningful way, one needs to look at his entire corpus, and hopefully this beetle will leave, to be able to understand him. And a little background information and context on where the literature stands on certain things. It's important to note that Plato, we don't know the chronology of Plato's works. We don't know when Plato wrote particular dialogues. The only one which we really have a definite time of is Theaetetus. And Theaetetus is a dialogue in his late period, and we're going to talk about what these periods mean. But we know it was written during the end of his life, or near the end of his life, because of the fact that it was written in honor of Theaetetus' death, which Theaetetus was a student of Plato. Also, excuse me if my pronunciations are bad here. My Greek is awful. So we know that Theaetetus was sort of written around this later period, but all the other dialogues we don't really have an exact idea of when it was written. But nevertheless, for convenience sake, we in literature separate Plato's dialogues into three parts: the early dialogues, the middle dialogues, and the late dialogues. Now, each of these dialogues have different functionings, or they sort of have different structures to them. So the early dialogues, they're also called the Socratic or Aparatic dialogues, and the most famous of which are Euthydemus, Laches, Greater Hippia, I believe Credo would be one of them too, and Apology. But Apology is a little different because Apology is one of a very distinct type of dialogue, but just on general, the Socratic dialogues take this specific structure. There are question and answer. So in Greek, ancient Greece, there were different types of oratory, right? And one of the oratories were long form speeches. So these were given in law courts or when making political decisions, or given like praise to something, like we see in the symposium, for example. But there are also different type of oratory, which is called heuristics. And heuristics is this question and answer situation where you have an interlocutor. The interlocutor is going to be usually the person who's going to be answering the questions. I don't recall if it has to necessarily be the one answering the questions, or if it's just the person who's, you're interacting with in the question and answering. So apologies if I'm not clear with that. And so the person who's answering the question sets a thesis, proposes a thesis, and is the job of the questioner to sort of refute the thesis. And so the questioner is oftentimes Socrates, who is trying to refute the thesis that some sophist is proposing. Now, the sophists are, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the sophists later in the video after I go through the three dialogues. The sophists are an important figure because Socrates is explicitly trying to combat the sophistic movement. If that's the general structure, at the end of the early dialogues, in each of them individually, you get an aphoretic ending, which means that Socrates sort of searches for a definition of something, like let's say, what is the X? And that can be courage, for example, in Laches. Euthyphro, it's piety. Greater Hippia, or Hippia's major, is the fine. Protagoras is virtue. Meno is virtue too. Things like that. And at the end, you don't find out what the definition is, right? So you don't get what exactly courage is, etc. But you get a greater understanding of okay, these are what is not courage, right? And what exactly Socrates is seeking in these definitional questions. So that's the early dialogues. The middle dialogues is where Plato lays out the positive theory of forms. Richard Rickless, I believe his first name is Richard, but Rickless, in his 2007 book, discusses specifically these middle dialogue theories as the high theory of forms. So it's the early version of the theory of forms, and it's the one that you get in Republic, Phaedo, and Symposium are the three big ones. Phaedrus, I believe, is also a middle dialogue. So you get discussion of the forms there. So that's the middle dialogues, but the middle dialogues they leave a lot of questions unanswered about the forms, particularly the question of partaking, which is what we're curious about here. And so that's in part what the late dialogues are about. Parmenides is what sets the late dialogues. After Parmenides, you get the late dialogues. And Parmenides is the big shift in the theory of forms. Some scholars argue to the extent that this theory changes, and some scholars are what we call Unitarians. So they believe that Plato's entire corpus can be understood cohesively. So if you read the late dialogues don't contradict the middle or early dialogues. Rather, they just expound on issues that weren't discussed in the middle and early dialogues. Versus a developmentalist view who sees that Plato's thought actually changes. So they argue that after Parmenides, Plato's view of forms, and when I'm more sympathetic to the developmentalist view, I should point out my biases here, they change after Parmenides, right? So the late dialogues, they're extremely important, most famous of which are Theaetetus, Timaeus, even though some argue it's a middle dialogue, Sophist, Statement, Philippus, and I think those are the main ones that are important. Yeah, okay, so that's the late dialogues. So to get a general gist, why do I bring this up? So in order to understand how forms partake of the sensible world partakes of forms, it's important to know the sort of general project that Plato is on throughout his whole corpus, which I would argue is the same project throughout the entire corpus, specifically in his metaphysical questions. So let's get to that. But before we get to that, I do want to preface this. Plato never gives a systematic understanding of what partaking means, okay? So nowhere in Plato does he explicitly lay out what he means by partaking. In fact, in Phaedo, he explicitly, I think it's 100 in D, he explicitly informs the reader, or the people who are hearing the dialogue, that he doesn't have a clue of what this partaking is, right? So that's important to preface with. But as I argue, and some scholars argue, we can deduce, or at least infer, based on the hints that we have throughout the entire theory, what this partaking means. And I'll discuss some of the general views that we have. But before we do that, we need to talk about the early dialogues, because the early dialogues is where you get the mission that Plato sets himself on. So, as I said, the early dialogues deal with questions of what is X, right? And what's important in the early dialogues is the fact that a lot of emphasis is put on what exactly Socrates means by a certain X, right? So in Laches, I'll give the example Laches because I think it's a good one. Socrates asks, I believe it is Laches, or whatever, he asks his interlocutor, what is courage? And his interlocutor gives a list of courageous acts. And Socrates says, look, I'm not looking for courageous acts, I'm looking at what is courage. And specifically what he's asking is not just like necessarily a definition of courage, but rather he's looking at what is the courage that makes courageous acts properly be called courageous. And he makes the same sort of view in the Meno, where he sort of asks, okay, Meno, what is virtue? And Meno says, okay, well, the virtue of a woman is to follow her husband, the virtue of a man is to be political, the virtue of a child is to obey their parents, the virtue of a slave is to obey the master, etc. So he gives different virtues for different social standings. And Socrates says, okay, that's cool, but again, like, do we properly understand virtue to be the same in all these cases? In the sense that when we speak of virtue, we're talking about the same thing in all these cases. He says, well, yes. He says, okay, then what is that virtue that is the same in all these cases? And he likens this to a question of a shape. Sort of, if I asked you what is a shape, and you said, oh, a shape is a rectangle, or rather, a rectangle is a shape, a triangle is a shape, a circle is a shape, you'd be like, okay, you're just listing shapes. Well, what is a shape, right? And that's sort of the question that the early dialogues give. And within the early dialogues, you get sort of a specific view of what this X is. And most importantly, it's that this X is unchanging. What does that mean? It means that when I say that, let's say, courage is a little bit more complex. So let's just do something like shape. We're going to use shape because I think it's easier. So when I say a rectangle is a shape and I say a triangle is a shape, when I say, what I'm really doing in this sentence constructor is I am attaching a predicate or a property to a subject. So I'm saying this subject is a certain predicate. And in literature, it's usually said is S is P, right? And so the question is, okay, but is this P the same in all S's that, are P? So when I say that a circle is a shape, what I mean by shape in a circle is the same thing I mean by shape in a triangle. And Socrates sort of argues, and Plato argues this too, and this is a very important thing in the late dialogues specifically, but is that they have to be consistent. When we're talking about a shape, whatever it is that we're saying that has shape or that is a shape, we must be talking about the same thing. The shape has to be consistent in all these things. It has to be immutable in that sense. And so that's the first thing that we get in the early dialogues, is the question of what some call oneness principle, which is that each form is one, right? So each, well, not at forms yet, but it can be fruitful to sort of describe them as forms. But each property, let's say property for now, each property is one. So virtue, when it's all these different distinct things, they all are one virtue, right? And similarly with shape, or any property that you can think of, all of them are actually one property, which all these things are just sort of having in some sense. Okay, that makes sense. The other one is causality. Causality says, okay, the reason why, and this gets laid out specifically in the middle dialogues, but this gets a little discussed in the Hippias Major, or Greater Hippias, depending on the translation, and I'm going to use fine here as the example. that the reason why fine things are fine is because they have some relationship with the fine, or fine in itself, fineness in itself. So when we say that, okay, this statue is fine, or this statue is beautiful, the reason why it's fine or beautiful is because of the fact that it's related to the fine or beautiful in some way, right? If it wasn't related with the fine or beautiful, it wouldn't be beautiful or fine. So it's the beautiful and the fine that makes things be beautiful and fine. So that's an important point of it too. The other one, there were three principles: causality, oneness. I forgot the third one. That's bad. But anyhow, that's sort of the project of the early dialogue. And why is that important? Just some discussion on what's going on before Socrates and Plato come in, which is the sophist movement. Now, the sophist movement have basically a wide ranging of theorems. But what were sophists? The sophists were not only a philosophical movement, but they're also an occupation. A sophist is somebody who gets paid for teaching a certain skill, and usually that skill is oratory. So, for example, a sophist, taking the example of Protagoras or Gorgias, it doesn't really matter, any sophist, or Euthydemus, all these different sophists, what they would do is you would go, you would pay them, and they would teach you how to speak, how to argue, right? And what's important for all these sophists is the fact that arguing is fundamental to Greek society. It was through arguments that you get what you want in court. It is through arguments that you win favors with people. You seem smart. You go to parties and, you give these, you engage in heuristics, which is this sort of back and forth of question and answering. And you impress you woo some women, you woo some men, you get everybody excited. And so there was a certain status with being able to be in a dialogue. And that was the purpose of oratory in general. It wasn't to search for truth or anything like that. And so the focus of oratory was rather just to be persuasive, of being convincing. And the sophists argued, and they justified this point by saying, look, there's no objective truth in the world. In fact, one of the biggest theorems of the sophists was the fact that one cannot even speak of untruth. I'm not going to go over the argument here because it's rather long, and you got to really focus on the terms to make it make sense. But they believed that there was no way to speak untruth. And not only was there no way to speak untruth, but also there is no objective truth. The world's always changing. It's always flowing. So actually what is truth is just perception. That's what Protagoras argues in that sense. He's like, okay, what is true to me is true. What is true to you is true, right? Each individual person, as they perceive reality and discuss it, it's true. So because we can't really attain any objective truth, we just got to work on this realm of persuasion. And so that's why Socrates is searching for these immutable things in themselves to say, no, they're actually not unchanging. They're actually not subjectively based, but rather they were universal in some way. And so that's the early dialogue project. But then the question comes, okay, if these things that you're saying in these questions, what is a shape, what is fine, what is virtue, what is courageous, what is piety, the question then becomes, okay, but what are we even talking about, right? What is piety and what is courage? Not only as in the sense of like a definition of them, but what are they, right? And so that's what requires the theory of forms, which is to make a metaphysical understanding of these objects, which if Plato wants to argue truth exists out there, and that truth is not something that's subjectively based, you need to give some metaphysical account of it. And so that's what the middle dialogues are trying to do. They're trying to give a metaphysical account of these things in themselves. And that's what sort of Plato employs a use of genus, an idea, to describe these things. And those are translated as forms. So now we're getting into the middle dialogue. And I think the most important middle dialogue there is to talk about forms is Phaedo. Because it is in the Phaedo that Socrates basically lays out his theory of causality. And it is in there that he sort of says, look, if I were to ask you a question like, why is 10 bigger than 8? What response would you give me? And the general response would be, okay, well, because 10 has 2, which 8 doesn't have, right? So 10 has more units than 8 does. He says, okay, but how many more units? 2 units. So what you're basically saying is that 10 is made bigger by the presence of 2 in it. Now, what Socrates wants to argue there is the fact that actually, that makes no sense. Why? Because 2 is something that's small in relation to 8 and in relation to 10. And how can something that is small make something big? Because for Plato and for Socrates equally, or rather, I'm going to use these terms interchangeably because after the early dialogues, it's all Plato really, but he still uses the mouthpiece of Socrates. So for Plato, the ridiculousness of the statement comes from the fact that something cannot come from its opposite. And so already we're getting a view of the forms that says, okay, if the forms are going to be the cause of something, if something is going to be the cause of something, in the sense that we meant in the early dialogue of like, okay, a pious thing is done by piety, then whatever piety is, it has to be pious. Whatever beauty is, it has to be beautiful. And this is called self-predication. It's an important component of the middle dialogues. Every form must resemble themselves. So whatever it is that we're searching for in piety must itself be pious, and must be pious in a way that is similar to the ways that things that are not piety itself are pious. And so that's one of the components of it. I'm not going to go in big on the arguments in the Phaedo because this would just take the whole video to really point out these arguments, but he makes a similar argument for tallness and for a series of other predications. He points out, look, if we take these simple answers, or he calls them the non-safe answers, right, of saying that, okay, well, 10 is bigger than 8 by the 2, or this person is bigger than another person by a head, or whatever, then we have to admit that something that is small makes things big, and something that is big makes things small, etc. And that, to him, is ridiculous. And somehow people agree with that point. And we're going to attack this point a little bit later, because that point gets specifically attacked in the late dialogues. But anyhow, that's sort of the middle dialogue view. Okay, so the forms have to resemble themselves in some way. But we also said they're unchanging. Well, how can it be unchanging? Because it's also important. If they're unchanging, why are they unchanging? And this is where Plato, and this gets laid out very well in the Republic, starts to divide the world into 2. There is the sensible world, which is ruled by becoming, and we're going to talk about that. And there is the world of the forms, the formal realm, which is ruled by being. So, why does he say the sensible world is ruled by becoming? Important to note that becoming in Greek is sort of understood as a movement from not being to being, or from being to not being, right? So it's a movement, it's a change. If you want to be Kantian, it's an alteration. And so this notion of being to not being is also attacked by some of the not early Socratics, the pre-Socratics, who sort of argue, look, the world can't have any change in it because of the fact that, how can something come from nothing, right? Same arguments that Christians make nowadays to point out that the universe needs some origin or some beginning, right? Nothing can come from, or something cannot come from nothing. And so, I believe it was, who was the one who made that argument? It might have been Protagoras. But no, Protagoras argues that, I don't recall exactly which pre-Socratic thinker makes this argument. But anyhow, it's not super relevant. What's relevant is this fact of becoming. And so, it's sort of accepted in the Greek world, and Plato takes this view too, that our world around us, the sensible world, is always changing. Things are always in this constant state of becoming. For example, he gives us in the Timaeus, even though it's a late dialogue, it's important to know that, air turns to fire, and then fire turns to air again, which then turns to water, then turns to ground. Everything's continuously in the state of motion and flux and change. And so if we are going to say that the forms exist, then we have to say that they exist separately from the sensible world, because the sensible world is continuously changing. Even things that are in the sensible world, they don't partake of the forms fully. Things, and this is important, the fact is that, for example, 10 is bigger than 8, and so 10 is big. But 10 can't also be the big because of the fact that 10 is small compared to 12. So 10 can't itself be the big, and so because it changes from being big and to not being big, that is, to being small. Same thing with somebody who's tall. Somebody can be tall in relation to one person and short in relation to another person. And so even in these relationships, we aren't fully, or things in the sensible world of ours aren't fully attached to a form, but rather they sort of completely change and modify which forms they're partaking in depending on the relationship they're in, depending on the space they're in, depending on the context they're in, etc. And so, okay, if we're going to say the sensible world continuously changes, then the forms can't be of the sensible world. They have to be just something that's, immutable, something that can't change. And that's what Plato identifies with the formal realm, the intelligible realm. Because in intelligibility, in things that are non-sensible, things are just pure being. And by pure being, I mean that they don't meddle in not being, which again is going to get challenged later, but not being for now is being seen as nothingness. So they don't meddle in nothingness. They meddle in being. And so the forms have to be distinct. They can't be in the sensible world, right? That's something that's emphasized in the Phaedo a lot. Not only that, but also the question of what makes them even more intelligible is how we access them. Meno, which is an early dialogue, but sort of quasi-middle dialogue, it's a transitional dialogue, points out the fact that in order to attain an understanding of the forms, we can only do so through introspection, specifically through dialectic, but dialectic is questioning and answering, but different from heuristics. Dialectic, the job is to search for truth, not necessarily to refute somebody, right? So it's a little distinct, but through dialectic, through discussion, we're able to arrive at the forms. Why is that? Because as Socrates sort of argues in his remembrance theory, the fact is that the only reason we are able to sort of properly say, okay, this thing is pious, that thing is courageous, etc., is because we have some knowledge of these things. So Socrates argues that in order to be able to acquire knowledge of the forms, we can only really know the forms if we already knew them all along, but we're just remembering them. And this remembering them means that we're not learning the forms in the sensible world. So I'm not learning what piety is by, an analysis of pious things, nor am I learning about the brave or whatever it is, whatever property, through analyzing them in the world, but rather I have some innate, a priori understanding of these things, and I simply forgotten them. And so when I see them, and this he argues in, I believe, Republic 7, my understanding is sort of lit up, and when I see them in reality, this brings me back to the image of it. And so it makes me recall them. He calls these perceptions as summoners, which means they summon the understanding to recall particular forms. And through the dialectic, I not only become good at sort of applying the forms to the world, but I also become good at understanding what the forms are in themselves without being applied to the world. And so in this sense, with these two arguments, we identified, okay, the forms are intelligible. They're not, found in sensible reality, which is what begets the first problem, which is, if they're not found in sensible reality, how is it that sensible reality manifests the forms, right? How is it that something that is not sensible appear in sensible things, which is what we're going to talk about, the question of partaking. And so this is another principle that's important for the middle dialogues. So with that in mind, now I forgot where we're at, which is bad, I should know this. But okay, we've already talked about causality, and we also talked about the fact that forms are immutable. And those are the two big principles. Also self-predication. We discussed self-predication. But now, causality is important here, because causality is not purely an epistemic claim. And this is what I argue. Some scholars disagree with this, but the way I see it, Plato is not saying that when we say, okay, S is P, so some subject displays this predicate, we're not saying that it displays this predicate purely in my perception or experience of the reality. So it's not just a philosophy of naming things. We aren't just saying, oh, this is pious because I know what piety is, and this resembles the pious in some way. But rather, it has in itself, in some meaningful way, the piety. So the forms don't only exist in this subjective sense where they only exist for me, and I just sort of, in reality, I just see things that happen to randomly resemble the forms. But rather, the forms exist ontologically in reality. The forms exist some way in the sensible world. And that's where the problem occurs, is how can we talk about intelligible things which are outside the sensible world, causing, that is actually meaningfully directing, perhaps, is a good way to think about it, directing the shape and state of things in the sensible world. And it's a question that Plato doesn't answer in the Middle Dialogues. He doesn't provide us an answer. And I'm going to smoke another cigarette while we're talking about this, because now we're going to talk about Parmenides, and I need another cigarette to be able to talk about Parmenides, because it's a big boy thing. An order. And it didn't light. Let's try another one, guys. Now it's a little better lit. It's not perfectly lit, but it's okay. So, Parmenides. Plato attempts to tackle this issue in his most famous work, famous in academia, nobody really knows about Parmenides outside of academia, but still one of his most famous works, which is Parmenides. What Parmenides tackles is, what does partaking mean? Because oftentimes, Plato uses this term, which I think is called metherkis or something like that. It starts M-E something, it's the Greek, which is translated often as partaking. Sensible world partakes of the forms. So things that are pious partake of piety, and that's the reason why they are pious. And so there are three ways in which Parmenides offers for sensible reality to partake of the forms. And in these three ways, we can divide it into two categories. The first are, I like to call them elemental views. So that is that the intelligible world is somehow in the material world. And the other view, which I like to call the schemata view, often called the paradigmatic view, is the one where rather they resemble things. And so they're in the world in more of a sense of like a building has within itself the blueprint of itself, because it's made in the model of the blueprint, right? So it's not that the blueprint is literally physically inside the building, but rather that the building somehow, looks similar to the model because it's built with the model in mind, right? So there's these two views, and I think the elemental view is important to talk about first. So the elemental view borrows a lot from Anaxagorean philosophy, and Anaxagoras was a pre-Socratic thinker who, like Plato, divided the world into two: the elemental world and the sensible world. The elemental world can be likened to an atomic understanding of reality, where there's these basic, at the time, unsplittable, simple substances, which are pure exemplars of themselves, that make things in our perceptible reality be akin to the elemental things. Take gold, for example. So when we say a watch is golden, or a watch is gold, or a gold watch, right? What we mean is that it has a sufficient amount of gold in it to make it a gold watch. And so this Anaxagorean view basically abstracts this to all physical objects. When we say, oh, this this is a wooden chair, for example, that I'm looking at. It basically is composed of the elemental wood mixed with some other things, but because it has enough of a share of wood, pure wood, then that must mean that, you know, it's probably called a wooden chair. And what some scholars view is that Plato, specifically in the Middle Dialogues, is sort of increasing this view. He's saying, okay, it's not only about gold and wood and bronze and water and fire, etc., but also beauty and piety and courage. So these are actual substance in some way. And that physical reality, so when we say, oh, an act is courageous or somebody's taller than another person, that means that they have an actual share. They have this in their very being, in a way. They're composed of the element of tallness or the element of whatever it is, piety, etc., right? Now, in this view, they share with it imperfectly because they're constantly sort of losing and gaining these things depending on like the context, etc. So it's kind of like they have enough share of it, but they also have shares of the opposite. So if we are to talk about tallness, for example, which I think is the best example to illustrate this, why is one person taller than another? Oh, because that person has a bigger share of the tall. They have more tallness in them than another person. And why are they shorter than another person? Because they have less tallness, or they have more shortness than another person. So that's sort of part of the view, right? But there's a couple problems with this view, and that's the ones that Parmenides really talks about, which is the fact that, okay, let's take this view and let's talk about tallness. So let's say, in order for me to be tall compared to someone else, that means I must have tallness within me, right? That's kind of how the argument follows. But that means I have a share of the tall that is bigger, that is taller than another person's share. Now, in order for the tall to make me tall, it must self-exemplify itself in a very literal way of like self-instantiation. For gold to make a golden watch gold, it has to be golden. The gold has to be golden to make things golden. And so the tall has to be tall to make things tall. And so somehow I have this tall thing within me in this very basic elemental level, but the other person also has tall in them. And that means my tall is taller than their tall. And if my tall is taller or bigger than their tall, then they're encountering a problem because now their tall is short. And as we already established, we can't have the tall be short, right? So the forms need to be purely themselves. So in order for the tall to make me tall, it has to be purely tall. Just as the gold, to make things golden, has to be purely golden. The gold can't also not be golden, because if it's also not golden, then it wouldn't make people fully golden. Because if it wasn't fully golden, so the gold is not fully golden, and instead is, let's say, a little bit silvery, then that must mean that there's some within the gold, there's a further part of it, one part that is golden and the other part that's silvery, and then we're saying, okay, well, now the new form is the golden part, not the silvery part. So within this form of the gold, we've sort of deduced another form of gold, which makes the gold golden. But then this new form also has the same issue, which then means that there's another form, and you have so ad infinitum. And because you have it ad infinitum, what leads to the contradiction is the fact that you don't have an initial gold, which is what we've been searching for this entire time, that makes things golden. And so similarly, the tall in this case, if the tall is not purely tall, then it must mean it has some share of tall within the tall. And so that means that this new share of tall is the new form of tall, but this new form of tall also has a share of the small, so it means it also has a share of the tall, which is a new form of tall, so on ad infinitum, right? So the Anaxagorean view doesn't really work. Okay, and that's what Parmenides sort of points out when he's talking about parts. And so that's the issue with the Anaxagorean view. But the other view is a resembling view. And that's the one where Plato seems to adopt slightly in the late dialogues, which is the question of likeness. So we say that, okay, maybe, there is no physical, material substance underneath reality that is beautiful or tall, but rather, look, tall things resemble the form of tall, right? And so, basically, when I say, well, I'm taller than this other person, what I mean is that this other person simply, whatever, has their appearance resembles the tall, or the relationship that they enter with someone else resembles the tall. And what Parmenides shows that is problematic with this view is that he makes a variation of the third man argument. The third argument is basically what I did about the partaking issue, which is that it leads to an infinite amount of forms. And what he means by likeness is this. Okay, let's say that, sure, it's like something. But if X is like Y, then Y must be like X, right? This is a pretty simple principle, which I think we can all agree to. And it basically is simple. If we say like, oh, this chair is like the form of a chair, then the form of a chair has to be like the thing that we're saying it's like. But then we get a bit of a problem, because now we're saying, okay, if that thing is like, if the form is also like the sensible thing, then there must be something that makes the form like the sensible thing, and something that makes the sensible thing like the form. Because the form is not purely like the sensible thing. The form is also unlike the sensible thing in various ways, and sensible things also unlike. So what is it about the sensible thing and about the form that makes it like? Well, there has to be something else that makes it like, and that would be the new form. But if the new form is also like the chair, if we're maintaining the view of partaking as like, and so you also get a new form, and a new form, and a new form, and a new form, and you get this ad infinitum again, which again, we don't have the grounding that we needed. So the like view also sort of doesn't work. And so then the question is, how the fuck do forms partake of sensible reality? People have wrestled with different answers to this. Very, I wouldn't say a mainstream view, but a powerful view is that offered by Vlastos. Vlastos says, okay, maybe the forms, we're understanding this partaking in a wrong way. Maybe forms are just definitions. They're just logical, metaphysical definitions. So when we say, okay, why is a square, it rather is that the definition of a square, which, if I'm correct, it should be shaped with four sides, which all equal each other, and and each of the angles add up to 360, the four angles, etc. So it has a series of definitions. And so when I see a square in reality, in sensible reality, it just fits of that definition, and because it fits that definition, it partakes of the definition. So it's the blueprint view, basically, but it's a little bit weaker than the blueprint view, because it's not saying that, sensible reality really, in any ontological sense, is related to the forms, but rather it is our cognition of the sensible reality which makes it gain all these properties. So it's me, with my knowledge of the logical metaphysical form, applying that logical metaphysical form to reality, that thus makes, whatever my experience of a square. So that doesn't fully seem like what Plato is trying to do. Because Plato, even though he's not concerned with giving very mechanical causes to the world, and these mechanical causes, we can just say like physical causes, right? So like forces or whatever. Any relationship that is an efficient cause, right? If in the Aristotelian sense. But nevertheless, he's still trying to say some ontological thing. He's still trying to say that, okay, sensible things actually partake of the formal world. It's not just something that our cognition adds to them. He's not giving like this almost proto-Kantian view. And so the Vlastos view is like fine, but then again, it doesn't really meet what Plato's trying to do. It works, sure, but it doesn't really tell us much. And so there's other views. There's some views that say, okay, which is the Timaeus view, is that actually there is a God. There is a God which looks at these blueprints. He look at these logical. Apologies, my storage got full, and so I had to upload a video to my computer and do all this stuff with it, and it took a lot of time, and that was annoying. But returning to what we were saying, I mean, you guys are not going to experience this because I'm just going to cut it. So it's not like, it's going to be second. I'm rambling. The point is, okay, logical metaphysical forms in the Timaeus. So God basically takes the most gorgeous form of all, which is the living thing, the form of the living thing, the form of life itself. and he fashions the chaotic matter of the world out of this into this form, which is the living thing in the sensible world. And thus, after doing so, he creates a series of other sensible universals, which are sort of the forms in actuality, in reality, based upon the forms in themselves, which, for still taking a bit from the Vlasto's view, are the logical metaphysical definitions. So basically, he's taking all these blueprints and he's looking at reality and he's just making it based on those blueprints. And that's a fine view if you're Christian, for example. In fact, a lot of the not late Christians, but a lot of the early Christians that preceded Plato and who were influenced by Plato, Augustine being one of them, take this view, right? If you read Confessions, the last parts of Confessions, Augustine talks a lot about this. Talks a lot about like this chaotic matter of the universe that then sort of God fashioned it based upon sort of his own image. Again, Christian view doesn't really differentiate between the forms being outside of God, rather sort of they're all in God, they're all part of God. But in the Platonic view, they're kind of kept distinct. But this divine craftsmen, right, it's one person or one God, goes on and fashions the world. And again, that's a fine view, as I said, if you're a Christian or if you believe in God. But I mean, it's like a cheap cop-out. It's a deus ex machina, right? It's a sort of like, well, I can't really explain partaking in a meaningful sense, so I'm going to just give it up to God. God fashioned reality to sort of appear after the forms, to sort of imitate the forms. And there's some backing to this form, even as this backing to this view of forms, even in Republic, for example, the allegory of the cave. The allegory of the cave sort of describes the two tiers of reality, between like the world outside the cave, which is beautiful because it's illuminated by the sun, which previously was associated with the good in Republic 6, the end of Republic 6, and versus the world inside the cave, which is just shadows and sort of lacks a lot of the breadth and character of the things in themselves, which sort of is the world outside the cave, which is, again, supposed to represent the formal world. And still, in that Republic view, these things are kept distinct. The world outside the cave doesn't really impact in any meaningful sense the world inside the cave. But inside the cave, we know that sort of there are these wooden statues or whatever that are being passed in front of the fire, which is casting shadows. And so sort of we're supposed to take, as some scholars have interpreted, like my professor, Professor Mann, and also Dr. Menwald, who sort of see that maybe this is a sort of a foil to understanding relationships between form and sensible world, and that they imitate the actual formal world, but in a lesser sense, because since they deal with matter, they can't quite get the breadth and the beauty and all the etc. aspects of the forms. Rather, they have to kind of reduce them to a lower dimension, and so they lose a little bit of what makes the forms beautiful. But again, all these views that deal with it like this inevitably have to give up to some idea of God, which I didn't particularly, want to commit myself to. Not because I'm some staunch atheist, but rather because I just think like it's a cop-out answer. It's, we have to presuppose something that's completely unrelated to anything that we've, established from these theorems, which are grounded in things that I think make a lot of sense. And now we're just sort of bringing in some element outside of the entire logic of the theorem to make sense of this partaking. And so sort of I was thinking, perhaps there's another view. And that view, I took a lot of inspiration from the Theaetetus, which is personally my favorite Platonic dialogue. Because in the Theaetetus, a discussion of perception is had. And in this discussion of perception, Socrates talks about what is needed for things to be perceived. And this is also slightly discussed in Republic 6, but it's really dealt with in Theaetetus, where let's talk about a basic experience. Let's look at this pen, okay? Let's just assume that the entire pen is black, and so we're going to call this pen black. What exactly is this phenomenon, which is me experiencing this pen being black? What Socrates outlines is that there's 4 elements to this. The 2 main components is going to be the pen itself. So the object of my experience, or the object of perception, and also the object which begets the perception, which is my sight in this case. Right? So there's the subject and there's the object. So 2 components. Then there's 2 other components. There is the blackness, and there is also sight. And so what happens is that all these things are flowing into the world. They're all changing. Time is passing. The earth is, spinning crazy. The entire solar system is also spinning, and everything's in motion. Everything is happening at the same time. But what happens is that this pen here, as it is moving through space, as it's changing and altering, meets blackness, which is doing the same thing, just like everything else is. But the thing about blackness that's distinct is that blackness is not altering. It's not changing its being in any meaningful way. Rather, it's staying immutable. But blackness is moving in some sense. And it imparts itself onto this. It sort of passes through it. And this passing through it meets with my own perception of this, which also meets with sight. Sight is passing on the world in an immutable way. It passes through my eyes become seeing eyes, and the seeing eyes then meet this object who's also meeting with the black, and then it perceives this pen as a black pen. And now don't get too hung up on this movement shit, okay? Just take it in good faith that it's an analogy, but the point is that you have these 4 elements that are meeting, which nevertheless is true, right? Light is meeting my eyes so that I can see. My eyes are looking at this pen. This pen does exist. Again, we're assuming this, but nevertheless, you would commonly agree that this pen exists. And this pen is not ontologically black. It's not, the pen's nature is not to be black, but rather, light is hitting it, and because of the components of the pen, sort of leads it to appear black, and so appear as a black pen. And even though the Theaetetus doesn't specifically identify this whiteness, he uses whiteness, in this case we're using blackness, as a form, they still sort of function that way, and it's hinted towards being that. So I was thinking maybe the forms have some relation with our world, so maybe there is some credit to the elemental view. But what the elemental view does wrong is that it treats the forms as these substances rather than perhaps light, making the distinction here, which I guess light is a wave and a particle, but making a analogous distinction between waves and particles. Because we encounter a problem, again, as I mentioned before, with the issue of sight, or rather not sight, but the tallness, because of the fact that the tall shows up to be small. But that's because we're thinking of the tall in a quantitative sense. We're thinking of the tall as there's an aggregate amount of the elements of tallness, rather than thinking of tallness as one thing that is shining, or it's passing through certain things. So why am I taller than this other person? Well, it's because tallness sort of shines on me when I'm in relation to this other person. And that's why I appear tall. And that's why I'm tall, because it shines on me in that relationship. And shortness shines on the other person. And so in that sense, if we talk about shining, then it doesn't necessarily lead to contradiction if we are to say, well, my tallness or the other person's tallness is shorter than my tallness or less tall than my tallness, because that person at that particular relationship doesn't have any tallness. They're not partaking of tallness whatsoever. They're partaking of shortness, because shortness is what's being sort of impressed onto them. Then the question naturally is beget, which is, okay, what the fuck is this shining, Kyle? Like, you're talking about the shining, it's all great and good. I mean, when you're thinking about pens and colors and things that we know to be in sensible reality empirically, and the laws of physics sort of demonstrate that we're talking about waves. Things are black because a particular wavelength is able to sort of meet the object and be bounced back, right, compared to others. Well, I guess black is like the absorption of all the... Maybe I should have chosen a better color. But nevertheless, like, okay, we can talk about, color maybe, or even sound, things like that, but, beauty, piety, tallness, like, talking about waves, man, what the fuck are you talking about? And it's a fair criticism, right? And that I don't quite have an answer to, which I think is kind of what I'm working on and finding the biggest challenge in my paper is that, but I feel like we're in the right path somehow. Because the shining can come from a variety of things. If you want to take a very Kantian reading, and you want to take a very Kantian view of Plato, which is, as some may well argue, and justifiably so, is kind of disingenuous, you can sort of say, well, maybe, the perception view have some point, and the schemata view has some point too. The paradigmatic view, as Vlastos puts it, has some view, but the point is that it's not only like subjectively implanting things in reality. It's not like I'm subjectively, perceiving something in this way, but rather that the thing as it is binds as a perception. The objects of perception are not, just like I'm witnessing the world out there as it is, and, the forms are just being put on top of it through my interpretation of them. So, in other words, my perception of things actually isn't what imparts all these various forms, but rather me thinking about my perceptions is what does it. Rather, in the view that I'm proposing, they are actually in the perceptions. They are. Like, this pen is black, even if it's not ontologically black, in the sense that it's, the pen is not actually black if I wasn't there to perceive it to be black. Nevertheless, it's black because I'm the one perceiving it. I perceive it as such. The objects of my perception, as Theaetetus puts it, actually have these qualities because they're objects of perception. They're only objects of perception insofar as there is a perceiver. So in this Kantian reading, the forms exist only in the realm of appearances, the realm of perceptions, right? And that's the one with which we interact with. We don't actually see the sensible world in and of itself. We see the sensible world through the filter of perception. And it is this filter that imparts onto the world it's what imparts the forms into the world. And is that justifiable reading of Plato? I can't really say that it truly is, because we're having to bring in so much labor from Kant into this reading of Plato, and which Plato just clearly didn't have access to. And I don't think, the Greek world really conceived of noumena and phenomena the ways that Kant conceives it, or at least the ways that we're arguing it here. But I would also argue that that's not necessarily Plato's project at all. And what's important for Plato is that when he writes, he isn't writing just to, give his ideas, but rather he's writing because he wants his successors or people who read him to join the intellectual conversation. I don't think, and I truly believe this, I don't think Plato had a conception of partaking that was, systematic enough that he believed in it. I think that we see in the Phaedo, we see in Parmenides, and we see it even in Timaeus, that anytime he tries to give a understanding of partaking, he always prefaces with the fact that, hey, I don't know this, or that, hey, there are problems with this view. Phaedo explicitly says this. Parmenides, the entire first section of that text, is dedicating to showing that. And Timaeus, you get two prefaces. You get one where Timaeus himself admits to the fact that this account of the world is a likely account, and that we, being humans, will never reach the true account. And also, a little bit before that, when a story is being told about the coming together of like an Athenian civilization with the Egyptian civilization, the Egyptians point out the fact that, the upper Mediterranean actually have been, continuously destroyed by many floods and many natural disasters that sort of causes the upper Mediterranean world to regress and to sort of forget things of the past, because, and that's the example that's given to this, that they think that there's only one great flood, when in fact there has been many great floods. And so in Timaeus, he also prefaces that he doesn't fully know, and I think that that's the point, and that's why, somebody like Aristotle is going to put so much flack on Plato, because he says, look, you don't have an account of this. You can't give us a good account of how they participate in the sensible world. And so this view, while I don't think it's necessarily shared by Plato, I think that it's the only one that we can do without biting too many bullets. Because, again, the elemental view is just patently false. It just doesn't work. We can't see the world as substance in the way that Anaxagoras conceived of it when we're talking about things like tallness or beauty, etc. Similarly, the view such as the schemata view is just too weak of a view. It doesn't give any discussion of ontology in any meaningful way. Rather, it's just sort of a view that is purely descriptive of naming things. Oh yeah, I can name that as a square. Yeah, I can name that. And so the other view, the Timaeus view, the view of God, is, a deus ex machina. But the view of perceptions and sort of the proto-Kantian, quasi-Kantian reading of all of this can be the only one which I think provides us with a meaningful way to tackle all these issues. And I want to point out a specific passage from the Phaedo, which the exact number of the passages sort of escaping my memory here, but which was very important to me, and it was sort of what grounded my reading of all of this, which is the question of the equal. And I want to bring this up because I think it's important. It's a good way to finish this entire discussion, which is, when we talk about things being equal, perceptions being equal, what do we mean by equal? And how do we know that things are equal? How do I know that, for example, both of these things are books, right? I must be intuiting certain qualities of this thing and certain qualities of this thing, these two distinct objects. And then I must be saying to myself, wait a minute, some of these qualities are similar or equal to these qualities. Such as, a harder shell than the inner layer, the shape of the book, as in like it's binded this way, but it's not binded out here. It has words in them, even though the words are ordered in a different way and they're different words, nevertheless there's words, there's paper in it, the way it feels on my hand is somewhat similar, etc. So I must be able to say that there's equal, but I can only have a conception of equality, a conception of this perception and this perception, even though they have some distinction, nevertheless are similar in some ways. I need to have some notion of the similar. So I must have this a priori knowledge of the equal before I'm even able to interpret my reality. And so perhaps there's credit to this view that, the black is shining onto this object because of the fact that my perception of it sort of, and in the case of like the black that's shining onto the object, in this case, is external to my thing, right? So the world, the way the light hits, whatever, but my perception of it is actually making this object be black. Similarly, in the view of piety, when I see a pious action, I am actually imbuing in my own perception of it piety into the object. My experience of the pious thing is making it pious. It's not just something that I later, rethink about, but rather it is itself pious. So piety is there, but it's not there in the substance of the thing. Rather, it's just there in the way of me perceiving it. And so that's kind of my view of how we can tackle with the forms. Now we just encounter problems of which forms can be proven. Equality, we sort of are able to prove. That, equality must be a priori, and it must be in me to be able to conceive of things as equal. And this is where we get to the Kantian reading, which I'm not, discussing Kant here is going to be a lot of a different discussion. But in Kant, the understanding has certain categories which make experience experienceable. And I think that those are the only forms we can really justify. It's hard to make a justification of, okay, how do we know that the beautiful truly exists and all these things? But I think Plato takes this for granted. Many times he takes it for granted. I don't think there has been a proper argument for the existence of the forms, save Theaetetus and Cratylus. Theaetetus more deliberately, but really the proof is just saying that there must be certain things that are same. There must be some things that are equal for discourse to be able to be had. Which again is not a very good ontological argument. So, with all of that said, that's my view of forms partaking. The sensible word partaking of forms. And I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's long. I've noticed here there's probably more than an hour now, which, I doubt many people will get to this point of the video, because I also realize that maybe this is a boring topic and maybe sort of like the way I'm presenting it is not as interesting, and I know I digress a lot, and excuse me for that. But I don't know, this may be something that I make more videos. I've been sort of thinking about making a video on Kant. I have previously written a paper on Kant, specifically on causality, and so perhaps I can sort of look back into that paper, go back into some of my readings, and then make a video on Kant. I also had written a script about a year ago for a video on Nietzsche that I could bring up again, specifically into 8 things that I thought was interesting about Nietzsche's writings. And one of the topics that I really want to talk about is how did Nietzsche conceive of revenge? How did Nietzsche conceive of the historical sense? How did Nietzsche conceive of instincts, or rather how philosophies are dictated through our psychological, psychic organizations, right? A constitution is a better way to say it. And so there's a couple ideas of videos. I also want to make a video called Why Philosophy? Why I think philosophy is important. Talking a bit about my journey in philosophy, what made me want to do philosophy. Because I know this video hasn't mentioned it, but I'm studying philosophy at Columbia University with amazing professors, great program. I mean, I can't even say how lucky I am to be able to talk with these incredibly intellectual minds. I want to do a video on Axel Honneth, for example, one of my professors who I've read a bit of his work. So there are many things that I want to do videos on, but I was kind of, still thinking about what I wanted to make them on and exactly how to make them, because I didn't want them to be shitty videos. I didn't want them to be non-nuanced videos, right? One of my concerns coming into making YouTube videos was the fact that most videos are done poorly. They're not done well. I think most YouTube videos are not fun to watch. Not that they're not fun to watch, but I think they're misinformation, as I pointed out at the beginning of the video. And so I wanted to make sure that the videos I make are not misinforming the audience, and rather they're based on research and actual reading of the text, and always staying grounded with the text, rather than sort of just saying Nietzsche says, or Nietzsche thinks this, and etc. I don't bring up here many direct quotes. I still talking about text, talking about passages, talking about all these things. in which I think is lacking a lot in these YouTube videos nowadays. And so yeah, I wanted to sort of make more videos, but I wanted to make sure that I'm careful with them and I take a lot of time. Even though this video took about an hour to film, right? And I didn't write a script for this video, I wrote a paper on what I'm talking about, right? I mean, I'm in the process of writing it. I've done a ton of research on this, and I've been spending like a month and a half doing research on this. So it's not something that I just kind of like, oh, let me just make a video on Plato, because I want to make sure that what I'm saying makes sense. And so when I make my video on Nietzsche, I'm going to have to read a lot more about Nietzsche, revisit a lot of the passages which I wrote on that script, look at what some secondary literature has to say, so that I can make this video on Nietzsche. I already have a paper, so I can sort of work off of that. But nevertheless, there's a lot of things that I want to modify in the paper, a lot of things that I need to find further justification for, etc. And so, yeah, that's sort of why these things take a long time. And, you know, also, this isn't my number one priority. It's just something that I do for fun because I think this is cool and I think it's a way to organize my thoughts and really think about things. And so, yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I can make more videos for people who want to watch them. If you don't want to watch them, don't watch them. You don't have to. And, yeah, I hope you have a great day. And I have nothing more to say, so I'm just going to cut it short now.